going to look at Ozymandias today. It's the first poem in the anthology, and it's probably the most well-known outside the anthology. Percy Bysshe Shelley was one of the great romantic poets, one of the real canon of English literature, and this is undoubtedly his most famous poem. And this idea of Ozymandias, this romantic view of Ozymandias, has permeated and gone across to society, really, for the message of how the mighty can fall. So the whole idea is of a great leader who thought he had power over all of the world, but actually his power never lasted, never got beyond the lengths of his own civilization. So why did Shelley write the poem? Well, he wrote the poem in 1819, and at that time British explorers and archaeologists were starting to excavate ruins in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt's ancient lands. And there were an enormous number of discoveries made at that point. Some of the most interesting discoveries were of enormous statues of one of the great leaders, Ozymandias. The name Ozymandias was one that the pharaoh gave to himself, meaning King of Kings. But actually the pharaoh was Ramesses II. Now Ramesses II was probably the richest of all of the Egyptian pharaohs. His reign lasted longer than any of the other pharaohs. And we also need to think about what the pharaohs stood for themselves. The pharaohs were gods in human form for the ancient Egyptians, and so they felt that they had ultimate control, ultimate power over all of their people, and were worshipped as such. So enormous statues, enormous monuments were built to these pharaohs, designed to show their wealth at that point, and their power and their control. And of course they felt at that point, as we all do, that our civilization will last forever. And of course we know that Egypt, once the greatest of all the countries, that power didn't last. The power of the pharaohs did not last beyond the Egyptian civilization. And the whole poem is an extended metaphor of how a statue that was once enormous, now looking so ruined, so broken, so shattered, is an image, a message to others that even great power doesn't last. This symbol, this huge statue of richness, of glory, has crumbled, just like the power itself that was once glorious, once all-powerful, has crumbled too. Okay, now I've mentioned the word romantic there. If you've looked at the prelude, you'll know that William Wordsworth was also another romantic poet, and romantic really with a capital R here. We're not talking about love poetry, we're talking about romantic poetry, and in this sense romantic poetry means poetry which expresses nature's power over man, how we should all see ourselves as insignificant compared to nature, and there's certainly elements of that within Ozymandias. Now, just a note about the form of the poem. Those aiming for the higher grades will want to look at the structure of the poem as well as some of its meaning. Now, this is written in a sonnet form, 14 lines, a regular rhyme scheme, an iambic pentameter, a series of 5 stressed and 5 unstressed syllables to reflect the pattern of natural speech. You'll have come across sonnets before. The prologue to Romeo and Juliet is a sonnet, for example. But the sonnet form had many different variations, and the most common was called the Petrarchan Sonnet. And without getting into too much detail, what Shelley does is breaks the rules of the Petrarchan Sonnet and twists the rhyme scheme. And so instead of having groups of quatrains, 4 lines that alternately rhyme, and then a rhyming couplet, Shelley does something different. He breaks it into an octet and a sextet, so you've got 8 lines that go together and 6 lines to go together. Now, as I've said in many of these presentations, and as I say in my classes, there's no point just describing that. You've got to give a reason why. And the reason why Shelley does that is because he's breaking a sonnet form, just like the statue is broken, just like the power is broken. So it reflects the whole idea of the meaning behind the poem, that power doesn't last, and the power, perhaps the rules of that Petrarchan sonnet can be broken just like power can be broken. So Shelley does that really quite cleverly within the poem. So here it is. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that it sculptor well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, one thing I've tried to reflect in the reading of the poem is the number of stops that Shelley puts in. We've got caesuras there. Look at line 3, stand in the desert, full stop, near them on the sand. We've got an awful lot of commas which force us to pause. Now again, just like we did with the sonnet form, we need to be thinking, why does Shelley do this? Why does Shelley put in so much punctuation, so much stopping and pausing in this poem? Well, I think the reason is because he wants to show that each period has its time. We need to stop and move on. And just like the power and just like the Petrarchan sonnet form, it's broken. And so the lines are broken. There is some enjambment, and usually the enjambment, those run-on lines, reflect how nature lasts. But the stops show the stopping of human power, the stopping of Ozymandias' power, who is that symbol of greatness and ultimate control. So Shelley uses those interesting bits of punctuation. We've got a colon in there as well. We'll come on to the colon in a second. But we've got the caesurae, the stops in the middle of the line. We've got the commas to show that pausing, to show that broken flow of command. I said we'd come on to the colon. I met a traveller from an antique land who said. Now that colon, just like in Storm on the Island by Seamus Heaney, we've got a colon very early in that poem too, which reflects that there's something significant coming afterwards. In Storm on the Island, the colon reflected all the ways that the villages, the community is prepared for the storm. In this case, Shelley is introducing how he's come to know about the statue of Ozymandias, and he's met a traveller who's come back from Egypt who said, and that who said, then the colon reflects that the rest of this poem is a quote from that traveller, the story told by that traveller coming back from Egypt to talk to Shelley about what he's found. And that very first line is quite interesting in itself. I met a traveller from an antique land. An antique land. Now, yes, he uses antique. It's got 2 syllables. It fits in with the sonnet form. But you've got to think about what poetry is. Poetry is the selection of the very best words in the best order. Somebody once described it in that way, the best words in the best order. And in this case, we've got to look at the individual choice of that adjective antique. And with word choices, we've got to think about what those connotations are. Why not an old land? He could have said an old country to fit in with the rhythm, perhaps. An antique land. Now, antique to me suggests old. Okay, so first of all, it's way in the past. And we think of the Egyptian civilization thousands of years ago as being not relevant to today, as being so old it now becomes antique. But then what else does antique? Well, it does suggest it was once valuable. Many antiques are still valuable, of course, but antique, something that was once of value. But looking at those 2 connotations together, we might suggest that it was once valuable. It isn't now because it's too old, it's too broken, it's too ruined. Now, also, antique suggests it's no longer relevant. It's there as an interesting piece, as a museum artefact, as something to look on and admire perhaps, but no longer relevant to today's life. So Ozymandias' power, the power of ancient Egypt, the power of those pharaoh gods, is no longer relevant to today's society, which is absolutely in contrast with how they would have felt at that time as the walking gods amongst men. So, I met a traveller from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. This is as far as we're going to go in this particular section. We've talked a lot about the structure, but I want to look at this, which is our key quote for this part of the presentation. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone. So, we've got to imagine what that statue must have looked like. The whole top, the trunkless, the trunk is from, your waist upwards. But that's all gone. All that are left are these enormous legs. First of all, that's an image of something that is broken. It's without a body, trunkless, without the torso, the arms, the head. It's without a body. It's a ruin. It's nothing now. There's nothing left that is worth preserving of that particular statue. But we also have the idea of vast, this adjective vast, which means enormous on a grand scale, is really crucial too, because this tells us that this was once an incredibly significant ruler. He was once incredibly rich, once incredibly powerful. You don't get an enormous statue unless you've got enormous power, and that vast suggests that. So let's have a look then at vast and trunkless together, and I've written that that's a juxtaposition, and that image in itself captures the sense, the meaning, the idea behind this poem, that something that was once rich and powerful is now a ruin. Somebody that once had all power and all command is now insignificant.